Hello, and welcome to another installment of Global Engagement Online Series, also known as GEOS, a program of the United Nations Association of the USA. My name is Farah Eck, and I'm Senior Director for UNA USA. Today, in partnership with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, we are recognizing World Refugee Day with 3 speakers who have intimate knowledge of and experience with refugees. I'm joined by my colleague Micah Spangler, who, as the UN Foundation's Director of Advocacy and Humanitarian Affairs, has worked closely with UNHCR to help policymakers understand the vital work the UN does protecting vulnerable refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers all around the world, from Bangladesh to South Sudan. He will be helping to moderate the Q&A session, which will occur after all 3 of our lovely speakers have had a chance to share their stories. If you have a question or want to make a comment that Micah will read aloud, please type them in the Q&A box, which can be found at the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, not in the chat box, which will not be monitored. And if you'd like to know more about these speakers, we encourage you to click on the link that has been placed in the chat box to read their bios. And now I'm pleased to turn it over to Micah to introduce our speakers and to start the conversation. Micah?
Thanks, Farah, and hello and welcome everybody. Glad that you could join us today. I'm really happy to be helping lead this conversation for us all as UNA USA to collectively honor World Refugee Day and learn more about how UNHCR and other humanitarian organizations are responding to this massive ongoing crisis. Some of you might know, but just a few days ago, UNHCR released its 2019 Global Trends Report, which shows that nearly 80 million people are forcibly displaced worldwide. That's the highest number UNHCR has ever recorded, up from about 70 million people just last year. So this is a really topical time to have this conversation, really looking forward to it. Our 3 speakers are going to provide an up-close look at what this displacement means, share their personal stories, and give us some insights on how we can get involved in their work. Before we hear from our speakers first, though, I'd like for us to watch a short video that depicts refugees from around the world who are not only overcoming the struggles of being in a new home, but are also helping their neighbors to overcome the challenges associated with the world's fight against COVID-19.
In the time of COVID, I cured the sick.
In the time of COVID-19, we kept people informed.
أنا عملت الصابون لأنه مجتمعي بحاجة له.
أنا خليت إخواتي وأطفال الجيران يتعلموا.
En tiempos de COVID, ayudé a los enfermos a llegar a un lugar seguro.
Nous prenons soin de nos voisins.
In the time of COVID-19, I helped my community stay safe.
In the time of COVID, we celebrate refugees fighting on the front lines of this pandemic, alongside their hosts and the aid workers supporting them. Because everyone needs help sometimes. Everyone can make a difference. Every action counts.
That's a great video. I want to start off with Omar. The bios are in the chat box, so please take a look at that if you want to learn a little bit more. But I'll turn it over to Omar, who is the founder and executive director of the Refugee Dream Center. Omar, over to you.
Thank you so much, Micah. Good afternoon. My name is Omar Bah. I'm the founder of the Refugee Dream Center here in Providence, Rhode Island. If you are joining us from Africa or from anywhere, just wanted to let you know that Rhode Island is the smallest state in the United States, and I'm from the smallest country on the mainland of Africa, Gambia. So that's the connection so that you can remember. But I became a refugee 14 years ago from Gambia. I was a journalist writing mostly about politics, and I went to school, high school, with many refugees from Sierra Leone. I had no idea what they were going through when I was a young person going to high school. Our school was inundated, kids living in camps or in abandoned hotels in Gambia, coming to our schools and going back. I did not know much. I did not interact much with them. In essence, I was oblivious. I was not paying attention like the regular person. And one day I became a refugee myself. I was declared wanted by a dictator in the Gambia for writing and investigating about the human rights abuses in his government. Then I went to Senegal and fled. The pictures were being still blasted about me. And I had to flee Senegal again and went to Ghana. And in Ghana, after 1 year, luckily, I was processed with the support of the UNHCR, with the American Embassy in Ghana, and resettled in the United States as a refugee. And just to emphasize, even though it was 1 year, I felt lucky because a lot of the refugees that I met in Ghana, mostly Liberian refugees then, were people who had been in camps for 10, 15 years or minimum 5 years, a long time. And I couldn't comprehend how someone could be in a refugee camp that long. So I found myself very lucky. But that 1 year that I spent as a refugee in Ghana was hell to me. I was always sick, both physically and psychologically. And being from Gambia, mental health is highly stigmatized. I didn't know much about it. Nobody told me about what might have been happening to me. I was always scared, always paranoid. Sometimes I would be alone, crying, thinking about my future, thinking what could happen, what would happen to me. I was thinking I would be caught and killed at any time. And luckily, I was able to resettle as a refugee in Rhode Island. And just like the typical journey of most refugees, I did not know where I was going until one day before my arrival. And I asked, I should have probably checked the papers, but I didn't know. And somebody at IOM told me that I was going to Providence, Rhode Island. And the first thing I thought was, is that an island, So they explained to me, they laughed at me first and, explained to me, showed me a map and said, oh, you're going to America, it's part of the States. The emphasis is how important it is for people to understand the journeys of refugees. You flee your country abruptly, unprepared, forced, and then you go to a place that you are not prepared for and that you don't know much or anything about. And then your life is all going to start from scratch, from the bottom. That is exactly what happened to me. When I came to Rhode Island, I was literally, I didn't know any other refugee from Gambia. Probably I was the only one. And I was afraid to interact with the other population from Gambia, like the regular immigrant population, because I was still scared. I didn't know what could happen. I didn't even want people to know I lived in Rhode Island, especially people from Gambia. So I lived in isolation, even though I had renewed hope. I'm lucky to be in a free country. I could rebuild my life again, but I lived in isolation, scared and not knowing what to do. And with the support of resettlement agencies, case workers here and there, I was able to secure a job after 19 days. But I thought to myself, I can help because I could read and write English. I could do something. And I started going to the resettlement agencies to support other refugees that I met there. Sometimes it's English, sometimes it's helping with housing, sometimes it's translation of documents. It was just a lot to do. And I felt this was my new form of journalism. If I was in trouble in Gambia for being a journalist, well, I wanted to just give a voice and empower others. And I had the chance to do it with my fellow refugees that I was meeting at various centers in Rhode Island. And that is exactly how my advocacy journey started advocating about fair housing, better resettlement for refugees, because the challenges are enormous. Even though refugees are among the most resilient, most hopeful population you can ever find. Despite the pain and challenges and struggle that people go through, they emerge, they adapt, and they rebuild their lives very quickly. And in the United States, you see people going to school, doing 2 jobs, running families, single parents, but they still survive. And that is the spirit that motivated me further. And eventually I founded the Refugee Dream Center, which the idea was to see how I can continue filling gaps, but also support refugees beyond the initial resettlement support period. And currently, about 90% of our staff former refugees or refugees who are with the refugee status. And the idea is for people to see refugees to see us as a mirror. If they can do it, we can do it. They're resettled. They're now helping us for them to also be motivated to empower and support their fellow refugees. And it all came into real picture when the COVID-19 came recently in 2020. We were all displaced because we had to close our building and we had to be driving around and helping. And luckily we got a lot of small grants here and there from local foundations and the state government. We started buying thousands of dollars worth of food and supplies every week to hundreds of families. It's a small state and a small city in Rhode Island. We used to serve about a client base of about 300 people. But when the COVID came, that increased to 700. We started buying food, cleaning supplies, diapers, everything the families need, and then paying rent, doing rental assistance, paying utilities, gas and electricity. And then that also coincided with a time when a lot of refugees, like every other person in America, were losing their jobs. But the unique thing and the problem with the refugee population was that we did not, or most of our people in the refugee population did not know that there is something called unemployment benefit. And even when they knew, they did not know how to reach out, how to apply, how to access these benefits. So we had to spend hours and hours with volunteers and staff to help dozens of individuals a day, which was a lot in terms of seeing the needs of these individuals. Some, like single mothers, we have refugees who came as single mothers with a lot of children. An average family is 6 or 7 children. You cannot go to work at the time of COVID when children have to stay at home. You have to help them with school, and you don't have a daycare open where you can take them to. So those are kinds of families that we were also helping. So it just entailed a lot and a lot of work that we needed to put in place. And we are glad to be able to, until now, continue to help in translation, helping with medical appointments, contact tracing, and everything around the community that refugees.
Thank you for sharing that, Omar. Really comprehensive. Thank you for the work you're doing. I know there's a strong refugee community there in Rhode Island, and I'm glad you're a part of it. I know we'll have a chance to chat a little bit more with the Q&A, so thanks for being here. I wanted to turn now to Ann Encontre. And if I read her whole bio, I think it would be the rest of the webinar. Safe to say she's been with UNHCR for over 25 years and currently serves as UNHCR's representative in Ethiopia. Ann, over to you.
Thank you. June the 20th is the day when UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, commemorates World Refugee Day. This year, because of the COVID pandemic, it's the first time in my 25 years career with UNHCR that we were not physically able to be with refugees. However, we celebrated in virtual forms. Refugees took it upon themselves, used the social media, sent messages in their own languages. They had other celebrations, but whereas traditionally they would have had cultural events, and we would have had about a week of leading up to World Refugee Day where they sang, they danced, they ate, they came together socially to really mark their appreciation to their neighbors, the host governments, and all the people that have welcomed them in countries of asylum. This year, however, the refugees took center stage in addressing the COVID virus and mitigating the damages and the spread of the virus. I'm speaking to you from Gambela. It's the western region of Ethiopia, bordering South Sudan. Here in Gambela, we have over 340 South Sudanese refugees in camps, in 7 camps, and in very crowded spaces, living together where we don't have enough space and accommodation for all of them. We opened recently, reopened in fact, a reception center, Pagak. And there in a very short space of time, we have now over 8,000 people in classrooms because schools are closed. and we haven't been able to have our usual teaching classes where you have a teacher in front of a blackboard with several children in the classroom. Without internet, without Wi-Fi and connectivity, like some other places, we haven't been able to have classes for children. But I can tell you about certain refugees, and one in particular, quote, Reth. He is a volunteer teacher in a refugee camp. And during this pandemic period, he has continued to offer classes, and he has up to 686 students, mainly adolescents and adults, every month. And he's absolutely the most humble person you can imagine, but he continues to operate and to keep these adolescents occupied so that at least they have some learning activities and keeping them out of trouble. When I say that refugees have taken center stage in managing and mitigating the spread of COVID virus, they have used loudspeakers, they speak in their own languages, they transmit messages that have been given to them by the Ministry of Health and other healthcare workers, and really taken on their responsibilities to mitigate the spread of the virus. In a country like Ethiopia, where we have 760,000 refugees from 26 countries, we've had 7 cases of COVID. Of course, we're not out of the woods, and we still have a lot of work to do. But the refugees have taken it on as their task and their responsibility. We've had to increase water trucking, water supplies. We've had to step up the hygiene. And how do you do this when you live in a one-room tukul? It's a one-room hut. They sleep together. You have people in family from 20 to 50 people. But yet they have managed to do this, and we have managed to help them with our partners, with our main government partner, ARA, to try to mitigate the risks. We would never have been able to do all this without the generosity and the open kindness of the American people, the government, and the people of the United States of America, who have contributed recently $64 million to our global pledge of $255 million to address the COVID-19 virus. It all goes to show that every action counts. No one should be left behind, and we all need the generous support of all involved to manage the spread of this pandemic that has touched all fabrics of society. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you for sharing that. I want to turn over now to Chris Boian. Chris is UNHCR spokesperson covering the US and the Caribbean, and he's based in Washington, DC. Chris?
Wow, well, Micah, thank you very much. I'd first of all like to say thank you to Farah and Micah, both the United Nations Association and the UN Foundation, for organizing this event to help all of us draw attention to World Refugee Day and to the refugee drama in itself as it is in the world today. And I would also very much like to thank my colleague Ann Encontre in Ethiopia and Omar Bah in the tiny little state of Rhode Island there. I must say, listening to both of them speak just now reminds me again of why I love the job that I do, because I get to work with people like this, like Ann, like Omar, and I learn something new every day. And what I learn is, and what I hope that everybody listening today can learn, maybe already knows or can learn more about, is the kinds of things we've just heard Ann and Omar speak about as examples are not abstractions. This is the concrete human reality of planet Earth in 2020. And it impresses me every time I hear my colleagues talk about what are we doing this day and this hour to address the needs of these human beings who are in need of protection. So I'm very inspired, and thank you for allowing us to be here, for inviting us and organizing this. Very quickly, I'll tell you a little bit of my own story. My name is Chris Boian. I'm the Senior Public Information Officer for UNHCR, based in Washington, D.C. I've been with UNHCR for about 5.5 years now, and the way I got here is perhaps not the standard route, although I'm not sure there is a standard route. I grew up in the state of Colorado. I grew up in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains west of Denver, Colorado, and I had a very unremarkable childhood. I enjoyed it. It was fun. For me, the world consisted of canyons and mountains, and the rest of the world was what was on the other side of those mountains. And so I grew up in Colorado, but by the time I was a teenager, let's say high school or getting into college, I started to become aware that there probably is a world beyond those mountains. And by the time I finished my undergraduate studies in 1985, I decided to get on an airplane, leave Colorado, and flew to Europe. And I spent the next 30 years working as a correspondent in places all around the world. And I spent much of the 90s actually covering armed conflicts in many parts of the world. And my first tactile or real experience with refugees occurred in about 1992, I believe. I was on the southern border of what was then the Soviet Union, or had just collapsed, the Soviet Union, along the border with Iran. And there was an armed conflict that had been taking place there for years. I was nearby when a big battle occurred for a town, and many people fled in extremis from that town and fled south towards the river, towards the border with Iran. And I was there, and they stopped for a few minutes to rest. And I approached an older man who had fled this town, was sitting down on a wooden stump, really, just trying to recover and pull himself together. And I began to speak with him, and I asked him about the circumstances, how the battle had unfolded, how the decision to flee had taken place. And then I got to the point and I asked him what he had managed to bring with him of his possessions. This was a man perhaps in his mid-70s, but lived a long and full life. And he showed me a very small metal teacup holder. And he said, this is what I brought with me. Out of all of his possessions and all of his life, he managed to escape with his life and his teacup holder. And that was a moment that I think galvanized my interest in refugees and my deep curiosity about what happens to people in those circumstances who are uprooted violently from their homes with no notice for a variety of reasons and are forced to flee that kind of violence, war, conflict, and persecution. And that was a moment that I think changed me. And since then, I've had a number of other experiences. Very quickly, I'll tell you a story. A few years ago, I was down in the Caribbean, in the Dominican Republic, actually. And I was working with some young people that were stateless, what we say. And they had no nationality. And what that meant in practical terms is they could go to school on the batay, the sort of sugarcane plantations where they were born and raised, up until the age of 18. And if they wanted to do anything with their lives beyond the age of 18, without a passport, without being recognized as a citizen of a country, it stops. And I met a young woman on one of these batays who had dreams about becoming a doctor and wanted to go to medical school, and who was very worried and frustrated about the fact that she was months away from graduating from high school and reaching that 18-year-old ceiling and not being able to do anything more with her life. And then she pulled out her cell phone and began to listen to music, and she listened to a song by, I don't know if you all know her, Nelly Furtado, a performer, very popular maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And this reminded me so much of my own daughter, who had a similar phone and the same song that she loved to listen to on that phone. And they had mannerisms that were alike, they looked alike, they behaved alike, and they had very similar dreams about what to do with their lives and how to fulfill themselves. But while my daughter was able to go to university after high school, this young woman, her name was Elvira, was going to be stopped there. And so these are the kinds of situations and the kinds of people that UNHCR deals with, and that I've had moments of experience with over time. And that we use World Refugee Day is about shining a light on these human beings, the circumstances of their forced displacement around the world, and the solutions that are at hand, the options that we as human beings have to address the needs of those people and to find solutions that give them access to safe places to live and to become themselves, to regain possession of their lives and to live full lives. That's what this is about, and I'll just wrap it up with that. But I just want to say thank you again for organizing this discussion and for helping us shine a light on that reality, because it is right here, right now.
Thank you, Chris. And I feel sometimes, you know, the number, whether it's 70 million or 80 million, can kind of be numbing after a while. And to hear of those personal, specific stories, each one of those million is a person with a story just like that, or perhaps worse. And to hear that is, I think, hopefully kind of is a bit of a rallying cry. If anyone has, we've got a couple questions here. If you have a question that you haven't typed in yet, please just move over to the Q&A section of your window and type your question in there. The first question is I think I can direct it to Ann or Chris, and it's from Arlene, and it's basically asking, you know, how is UNHCR dealing with the current realities of this administration? Without getting too political, I think it's fair to say that we all know that the administration has significantly reduced the number of refugees that they're willing to admit into the U.S. And I'm just curious, you know, that threshold is now somewhere around 18,000 people. And I'm just curious, either Chris or Ann, perhaps Ann, from your perspective in Ethiopia, have you seen that impact the ability for refugees and asylum seekers to be resettled in the U.S.?
Yeah, thank you. What we have observed and we have been experiencing, the quotas for resettlement have diminished, and this is since about 9/11. However, other countries have opened up and we've had other resettlement places. But the generosity of this administration and the government and the people of the United States has been constant. We can really rely on the government and the people of the United States of America, who have continued to contribute not only to UNHCR, but to other humanitarian agencies who are helping people live their lives away from home, uprooted, displaced, giving them hope. And it's true, Omar alluded to it, the resilience of refugees is phenomenal. They constantly have that hope for another life, improving the lives not only of themselves, but their own children. And that we cannot deny, that we've had financial and technical support from the United States government over the years, and even more recently, as I said earlier before, to the COVID-19 pandemic particularly. Thank you.
Mike, if I can just jump in for a second here to echo what Ann said. Yes, it's interesting because people should understand that the refugee phenomenon, if you like, and forced displacement phenomenon around the world is not a static reality. It is a human, it is the movement of human beings in all kinds of places, fleeing all kinds of just horrendous, violent, and frankly, very frightening circumstances. But it is a thing that is constantly changing, morphing, changing shape, changing both in size and in quality. It has to do, if you look at the case, for example, of Syria right now, and people that are fleeing Syria, the conflict and the violence that has just racked Syria for a decade now is in many ways very different from anything people have seen in the past. This is not massive, armies, formal military formations of state on state. These are non-state actors. It's a very fluid and constantly changing situation with different kinds of actors. So it's different qualitatively, it's different quantitatively. And this is a constantly changing reality that organizations like UNHCR are working with and are adapting with constantly. So we work with, and we work really for governments around the world, the United States and all other governments, to support them in doing the things that they wish to do and that they've undertaken to do, and to find solutions to this constantly evolving situation. That's how we approach our relationships with governments around the world.
Perfect, thank you. And that kind of really hits at another question. It's a really sort of simple question, but it's got a lot in it. It's from Jamal, and it says, really what is contributing to this massive refugee crisis that we're experiencing, the one that you just spoke about, Chris? And I thought maybe I could ask Omar, with on the ground in Providence and in Rhode Island, in the refugee communities that you're helping, Omar, is there any sort of one thread, one narrative, one region of folks you're helping, and what has kind of eventually brought them to the US?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing that up. I think, currently, actually the COVID-19 found a big problem that is already existing within the refugee community, because the threshold of reduction of acceptance going down from over 80,000 down to 18,000. A lot of refugees, people may think it affects only those in the refugee camps, but it's what affects one refugee affects everybody, because right here, people came in thinking they could file, they could reunite with their family members, and almost all those hopes were dashed away. It's not possible, or it's going to be very slow, or close to not happening. So these are some of the things that it is increasing trauma, it is increasing uncertainty, and just the inability to adjust properly in the most expected manner. And so this affects their economic status, it affects their well-being, their sense of belongingness. So it's a combination of so many stuff that were happening. And now COVID came, refugees, the first thing that we most need is that effort to belong, to adjust, to rebuild our lives. So once that is not possible, or it's made difficult, it becomes a big crisis. So I see this current year, all the things happening, the low threshold of acceptance for refugees in the US and COVID-19 is a double problem for refugees generally. And we see that in our small communities everywhere. Of course, there's a high level of resilience and hope, and the communities are amazingly supportive, the welcoming communities, but there is a high level of challenge and problem that refugees are challenged with.
Thank you. That actually hits on another question that Giovanni had, which is, of course, focused on COVID-19, and a real sort of question mark about what will the aftermath, hopefully the aftermath comes soon, but the aftermath of COVID-19, what do you think it's going to do to UNHCR's work? Are countries going to be willing to sort of break down barriers to resettle? Will it be a negative imprint? Maybe Anne, from your perspective in Ethiopia, what are you seeing? What are you thinking about that?
We really don't know what it will look like after COVID-19. For sure, our work has changed. Our work with refugees has changed. We've been forced to adapt new ways of working. But while COVID has affected negatively all aspects of our lives and that of refugees, we can only hope that we will find new ways of finding solutions for the problems and the plight of refugees. It's a passion that we have, and in this humanitarian sphere that we find ourselves, refugees, they're so resilient. It's unbelievable, where we think we will not have in our personal lives the strength to go on. They do. They find it, and we will have to accompany them, stay, deliver, and also help governments to help them find new ways of coping, finding new solutions for their problems. And it is daunting, but with a lot of enthusiasm and hope, we will have to accompany refugees. And I myself am committed to the cause. I can say that my colleagues throughout this period, many of them have not seen their families for 4 months, 5 months. It's been a real test of our commitment, but we're not alone. We have partners, we accompany governments, and I think we will survive, and we will have to find new ways of working to help people who need us and who depend on us for this support.
Thank you. I had another question from Jessica. Jessica was a UNA member, and she was actually in Greece not too long ago, volunteering with an NGO and exploring solutions to local integration of refugees. I think that's a constant sort of question is, how do you or how does UNHCR or other NGOs for that matter, Omar, how do they assist with once refugees are in a community, helping integrate them? And then on the other side, I think always a big question is the work that UNHCR does with host communities, easing tensions, ensuring that conflicts don't emerge. So just curious about that work and any comments anyone might have on that. Omar, you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the social capital within the refugee communities is enormous. I think that is what should always be harnessed to encourage refugees within their communities to participate within their communities to help, but also to utilize their existing potentials. So that social capital is what is keeping them going. I think that is sometimes what we overlook, but it's very, very powerful. You see people running around, helping each other, donating their own time and money and skills, and the receiving communities are also doing the same thing. And of course, sometimes tensions might happen. Sometimes there's increased level of trauma or angst in adjustment in a new situation, whether in a new country or in a camp. It's not easy, but it's always possible to overcome it. And that is exactly what usually happens within refugee communities. The difference is the diversity within those communities is what strengthens it. Sometimes, I meet with individuals and say, oh, you serve refugees from Africa. I said, no, we serve refugees from everywhere. So I speak 5 languages, but within our staff, it spans from refugees from all over the world. We speak 15 languages combined. And I think that's what we are able to utilize to harness the strengths and the skills within the communities to help everybody, but also to minimize the tensions. And we don't even notice differences within the communities, because that difference, that diversity is what strengthens the efforts that we are doing to help everybody or to mutually support each other.
I could jump in here for a moment, but I feel like I'm jumping in on Ann's territory in a little bit. I'll tell you very quickly, UNHCR, one of the things we do working with our partners around the world is we're all about looking for new and innovative solutions to situations that continue to occur. And the numbers, as you pointed out earlier, are growing at the moment. But we are working with all kinds of people around the world to find new solutions to address these problems that absolutely take into account, of course, the needs of people fleeing violence and persecution and their protection needs, but also and simultaneously the needs of host communities that are stepping up and welcoming these human beings. And I think Ann can speak to this better than I can, but Ethiopia is one of many cases in point where, for example, we've brought new kinds of partners into our refugee responses, both from the private sector, from development sectors, in ways that are lifting up, responding to the needs of refugees themselves, people uprooted from their homes, from their countries, but simultaneously responding to the needs and the developmental directions of host communities that are welcoming them and bringing them in. It's a win-win situation, and we're employing solutions like this now in Ethiopia, but in other places around the world that are bringing more people into the room, if you like, more people to the table for the discussion about solutions and the implementation of solutions. And these are people who have long wanted to be involved and have the resources to be involved in responding to refugees, but have been waiting for the kinds of guidance that is being made available to them now around the world. And maybe Ann wants to say something about what her team is doing in Ethiopia.
Thank you for that reminder. It's true that Ethiopia, which is one of the poorest countries on the continent, has been generously hosting refugees for decades. And in 2016 at the Obama Summit and in 2019 at a Global Refugee Forum in Geneva, Ethiopia made some very far-reaching promises, pledges and commitments to alleviate the situation of refugees, almost 1 million at one point, on the territory, joining its efforts and sharing the burden with other countries which will be contributing financially, technically, and otherwise. But Ethiopia has embraced the development agencies so that they will contribute to the refugee impacted areas and, broadly speaking, provide for not only the refugees in those areas, but also the hosting communities, which have welcomed refugees and shared what little they have. But it means that they will give it's a new way of working, it's a new way of finding solutions for refugees, the hosting communities, but also developing the country so that we can address the ravages of climate change, the ravages of all that we've had to deal with in this country, the poverty and the lack of infrastructure. And this will basically be a very promising new direction, a new way of helping refugees help themselves, be self-sufficient, and be able to have lasting solutions for themselves.
Thank you. And if I'm not mistaken, was it also news not too long ago that Ethiopia granted work permits to several refugees in the country? Was that something new, something you might be able to talk about?
That was also a part and parcel of these pledges that they made in 2016 and 2019, a broad and far-reaching refugee proclamation that gave refugees the right to live out of camps. So they've given permission to over 15,000 refugees to be out of camp, to be self-employed, to seek employment with other Ethiopians, to start small businesses, and to have the permission to work, have business licenses, and be able to indulge in agricultural development and planting and other small industry. And this has really been something that's a lesson. It's an innovation for them, and it's a good example for other countries in Africa and elsewhere as well.
Thank you. While we're focused on Ethiopia, Saeed had a comment saying that it's really impressive how the COVID cases and deaths in Ethiopia among refugees have remained so low. With, there's now outbreaks detected in Cox's Bazar and Dadaab in Kenya. Yes. What are some lessons that you're learning in these large refugee settings? You spoke about it a little bit earlier, but are there some lessons learned and some best practices to perhaps share?
I think one of the lessons that we have learned, the refugees have taken on this whole addressing the COVID pandemic as their responsibility. It doesn't mean that they're not accompanied. We have provided with the resources that we've been able to get, more water, more hygiene, more settings where they can have better management of preventing COVID, isolation centers, treatment centers, quarantines, but the refugees among the population have really taken on this charge of addressing, mitigating the damages, mitigating the risks, and helping to prevent the spread of the virus. The social distancing, when we have food distribution and you have thousands of refugees lining up, they find yardsticks to separate themselves so that they don't have to conglomerate together. They have invented different ways of making sure that they try to take turns to cook, to feed their families, and so on, really taking on the responsibilities of addressing the pandemic and mitigating all the risks that go with it. It's part of the whole dynamic, but I think that in a large part has played a very big role in trying to keep the numbers down.
Thank you. We have time for just one or two questions. So if you wanted to ask one, but you haven't had a chance yet, please just migrate over to the Q&A section. I just had a question for Chris. This is on my own. Is, when we talk about refugees, a lot of focus, Bangladesh, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya. Obviously, you cover the Caribbean. I was wondering if you might give us a little update, what might be happening in the Caribbean, particularly as COVID impacts islands in different ways. And I just think it's a region that isn't as much focus on, and I was wondering what the latest developments were.
Sure. Yes, the Caribbean is actually a fascinating region for anybody interested in looking at refugee flows, displacement flows, because the Caribbean itself is simultaneously a destination for people fleeing violence and persecution. It is a transit zone or transit region of people moving elsewhere, but through that region. And it is also a source in the world of people fleeing violence and persecution. I think the most salient, probably, feature of forced displacement that is impacting countries and territories across the Caribbean today is the movement of Venezuelans from that country. This is a massive, massive flow of people. It's what we would call a mixed flow of people. But we know that of the number just recently exceeded 5 million Venezuelans who have left their country in recent years. Now, we know that a very substantial number of those individuals have what we call protection needs. In other words, they are fleeing violence and persecution that make it impossible for them to return to their homes until such time as it is safe and they can do so safely and with dignity. And that movement of people out of Venezuela now is impacting a number of countries across the Caribbean region. And what we are seeing is a very wide variety of responses to the needs of these people. And so our organization is working very closely with partners in, for example, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Aruba and Curacao, other places that Venezuelans are moving to reach safe ground and to escape the situations that they're facing that are very, very threatening, life-threatening in their own countries. And so we're working with our partners and with the authorities in these countries across the Caribbean region to help them initiate, develop, expand, and improve very robust asylum responses wherever possible. Now, no two countries, no two territories is ever identical. And that's what the point I was trying to make earlier, is that the refugee drama and responses to it are situations that never look identical in any two places. We're talking about populations, countries, nation states, territories that are responding with the resources they have available, whether that be legislative resources, whether that be budgetary resources, whether that be humanitarian traditions and other protection infrastructure, how developed that is. It varies from place to place. And so a big part of what UNHCR is doing now across the Caribbean is working with partners, bringing other actors into the room, if you like, to focus minds on what is happening now in these places and to support governments and other actors, civil society, multilateral institutions in delivering the responses that all see are needed and that can be delivered in ways that are practical and effective, and make sure that every man, woman, and child that is fleeing for his or her life and needs protection is identified and receives that protection. That's the focus of our work there. It's a fast-moving situation, frankly. I don't suppose that's unique to the Caribbean, but that's what UNHCR is focused on in the region at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you. Very detailed response. Thank you. Our last question, I'm going to turn it over to Omar. Sort of a general question, but I think from the sense from the Q&A is the work that you're doing on the ground, helping refugee families, individuals in Rhode Island. What are some of the barriers once someone is settled and living somewhat of an adjusted life? How do you help them, say, for instance, with COVID-19, you mentioned helping them access unemployment benefits or things like that. What are the ways that you help someone navigate a really bureaucratic system, and perhaps how could someone get involved in that work?
Yeah, I mean, it's a daily challenge. It's difficult, but the fact that it's rewarding, that's what motivates me. Because I mean, a refugee with an accent, you know, trying to navigate the very complex funding system, for example, within the US, you know, from foundations to state or federal grants, it's difficult. You know, just to start with that, getting funding is very, very difficult. It's a challenge. Sometimes you don't have the expertise. Sometimes as refugee leaders, you just have the passion, but something is missing. So you have to build that kind of fundraising base to match with the passion so that you can do that work better. So I always talk to fellow refugee leaders across the country about this. The passion alone doesn't solve the problem. You know, all of us are passionate. We want to solve problems within our communities. We want to help fellow refugees, but you must build the skills. You must build the network needed so that we can fundraise in order to pay rent, in order to pay the utilities for clients, in order to pay staff, in order to pay the rent for the building where you are situated. Transportation needs, it's a lot that need funding, which is like a base that is needed. So that's always something that we emphasize, that we work very hard on. And we still, I mean, it's still a challenge. It's a daily challenge. It's an everyday struggle, because sometimes we are just relegated or boxed, some sort of framed as advocates or they're activists. So they're not supposed to think about, even people who come in to support us don't traditionally think of us as people who should be raising funds. It's just activists, you know, who should be in the streets organizing. No, it's a lot of work that needs funding, because you are dealing with basic human needs, with people needing support. Sometimes it's educational, sometimes it's rental or basic human needs, just the staffing needs, administrative. It's a lot that needs to come together. And then you see that you're supporting your fellow refugees or the community, no matter how small, in a culturally attuned manner, but also you are reaching a population sometimes that is very hard to reach. For instance, you know, during the COVID-19, we had a case where some refugee communities were gathering in one family, and you have people, 30, 40 people gathering in one house because people were unemployed and they just wanted to be together. There is a collectivist culture. And the departments of health didn't know what to do with that. They had to reach out to us to coordinate within the community, grassroots level, to help change, you know, educate individuals and change that. Most refugees do not watch the news when they arrive, the regular mainstream news in the TV stations. They watch their home country news or the news from refugee camps, WhatsApp messages back and forth with folks back in the camps. What we did was to create some sort of WhatsApp audios where we shared them on WhatsApp, on social media, some sort of a way to continuously reach every bit of the population that was sometimes difficult to reach, but also sharing culturally attuned, but also linguistically appropriate messages. So those are the kinds of things that we are doing, but also the challenges are a daily thing that which we recognize and we understand and we continue to work on. But the beautiful thing about it is, you see Muslim refugees and Christian refugees working together. You see African refugees and Middle Eastern refugees working together. People from even the Caribbean, from Southeast Asia, everywhere, people working together. There's no difference. There's no the issue of them and us. Everybody is working on the same platform at the same level and helping each other. And that is what the receiving community also is doing. And what we do, we harness that support. We have probably 10 times more volunteers than staff, and they do stuff that we would otherwise have paid people to do. People, coming in to donate material, toiletries, food, supplies to individuals. So sometimes it's just the coordination that you need to do within the community, and you'll be surprised at how many individuals that you can serve within your community.
Perfect. Thank you, Omar. And I just wanted to close and turn to Chris. Chris, UNA advocacy is in our DNA. First and foremost, we're big, strong advocates for a strong US-UN partnership, and that means fully funding our dues and making sure that the resources that UNHCR and UN agencies need to do their work gets supplied and properly prioritized. I was hoping, Chris, maybe you could close us out and tell us a little bit about how we can get involved and support refugees through UNHCR.
Yes, thank you, Mike. I will give you a couple of ideas. I would say there are a number of things. Number one, learn, read up on the news. Watch the movements of refugees. Watch refugee stories in the news around the world, but read some basic things too. Have a look, for example, at the Refugee Convention of 1951. It's not very long and it's not that technical, and it's actually quite interesting to read, and it spells out a lot of things in very basic terms. It's an interesting bedrock document to know about. I would also pick up on what Ann mentioned earlier, the Global Compact on Refugees. That can be found online. It was adopted at the end of 2019, at the end of 2018 actually, and that is conceptually a fascinating, multi-leveled, and very creative document that, from my perspective, marks a major leap forward in how the world thinks about refugees and responses to refugees, and how different actors that haven't traditionally been involved in responding to refugees can get involved and make a meaningful difference. It's a fascinating document. So read, of course. Follow refugee accounts online, Twitter, Facebook, whatever your social media platform of choice might be. So stay abreast of those things. And then we all know there are things you can do to help raise awareness about the kinds of things refugees face, the kinds of resilience they demonstrate in Rhode Island and many places around the world. You can engage on social media, and then there are all kinds of levels beyond that. If you want to get involved in actually working with organizations that are responding to refugees around the world, there are any number of those. We have resources online. I'd advise anyone to consult those. But I think, above all, the biggest piece of advice that I could offer to anybody that's interested in responding to refugees is to reject the idea that these are abstractions or these are colossal numbers, like you mentioned earlier, Mike. And remember that those large figures contained in reports in our work and that help paint a big picture, that is a tapestry of human individuals, just like you and me. And as Ann said, it's important to remember that these are human beings. This is here, this is now, and this is real. And so every single action counts. And that is true. Every single action makes a difference. And so I would encourage people to educate themselves and look at ways to engage, and it will make a difference.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you so much, Chris, for those steps to take action. And thank you both, Omar and Ann, for sharing your stories and your experiences, what you've seen, what you've heard and felt, for us as audience members to also see, hear, and feel. As Micah was mentioning, at UNA USA, our members don't just believe in the positive impact of UN agencies such as UNHCR, we like to do. One example of how we have done in the past is, very proudly, more than 20 UNA USA chapters have raised an astounding $319,000 for USA for UNHCR's Adopt a Future initiative. And the Adopt a Future initiative enabled children living in 2 refugee camps in Kenya, Kakuma and Dadaab, to have access to materials and supplies that they need to have a basic entry into education. So I also would be remiss if I didn't mention that we want to give you an opportunity as audience members to take action right now to support refugees. So please consider texting the word refugee to 738-674 so that you can tell your member of Congress that you care about the rights and well-being of the almost 80 million displaced around the world. And at UNA USA, we are privileged to partner with UN agencies like UNHCR, who are allowing people of all circumstances the chance to live better. And as we've talked about, UNA USA is a fantastic movement of more than 20,000 Americans, just like you, who know and believe that the United Nations is our best chance at living healthier, more just, and more peaceful lives in a better world. So please consider joining us by becoming a member. It's quite easy, and there are a variety of membership levels and types that will suit you and your life stage. And if you're interested in other provocative topics, issues, and speakers related to the United Nations, please join us for one of our many upcoming GEOs on July 8th for an insider look at the situation in Syria, which was alluded to earlier in our conversation. And then on July 15th, we have 2 major figures who will discuss the idea that multilateralism is under fire. So once again, thank you. A big thank you to our speakers, Omar Bah, Chris Boian, and Ann Encontre, my co-moderator, Micah Spangler, Jillian Wilson for helping behind the scenes, and also to you for joining us for today's important topic. So we wish you all health and happiness, and in particular, a very happy Independence Day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Bye. Thank you for having us. Bye.
Bye-bye.